Hi, this is Paul, and this is a Friday live stream that is going to talk about the Grail. And with me today, I'm going to have Richard Rohlin, and who's been on the channel before, and also Nate Hile, who runs Grail Country. And Richard's logged in, but he's not in front of his camera, and Nate isn't here yet. So I'm just going to begin by telling you how I got here. So again, probably for me, most of my life, the Holy Grail was something that you bumped into sort of in a vague way. I didn't read a lot of Arthurian legends when I was young, but you learn about King Arthur and Camelot and the Holy Grail. And then there was Monty Python, the quest for the Holy Grail. And then there was the Lost Crusade, Indiana Jones and the Lost Crusade, where you had the Holy Grail. And that was probably the extent to which the Holy Grail was ever in my imagination. And then, of course, a number of years ago, bump into Jordan Peterson, bump into Jonathan Pageau, get to know Jonathan Pageau. At first, sort of really confused about what Jonathan Pageau is doing, and bit by bit getting a little bit more understanding. And then Richard Rohlin and Jonathan are starting to do this universal history, and I'm trying to get my head wrapped around that universal history. And then Jonathan and Richard do a couple of episodes on the Holy Grail, and I listen to them, and it's just kind of like, well, that's odd, but okay, that's kind of cool. And a few weeks ago, the rest is history, with Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook, did a couple of episodes sort of around the Indiana Jones things. This was timed around the Indiana Jones, the latest Indiana Jones movie to come out. And they did one on the Ark of the Covenant, which of course had my interest. Richard, I'm just giving an update about how we got there. I'll bring you in a minute or two. And something's beeping at me.
Oh, that was me. Sorry.
Oh, okay. And then I listened to Tom Holland's thing on the Holy Grail, and I thought, because Tom Holland sort of approached it in a modernist historical fashion, but also Tom Holland is sort of in this space because even though Tom Holland is approaching things as a modern historian, Tom has a longing to live into the story. He's almost like Dorothy Sayers wanting to write herself into the story, but Tom very much wants to inhabit the world that he's been studying. And this has come obviously from his boyhood fascination with classical history and all of that. And so Tom is just on the fence playing with these things. And then I saw this show, Mrs. Davis, because Bishop Barron recommended it. And AI is important. AI is interesting. And I watched, sort of the show starts off similar to what sort of Bishop Barron portrayed. But the more I watched it, then suddenly the Holy Grail comes up. I thought, are they just being silly or cute? And then as the show develops, I thought, the show isn't about AI. This is a Grail story. And that led me to ask questions about, wait a minute, what are we talking about when we're talking about the Grail, and why are we talking about it? And in fact, this leads me into what exactly is the Grail and how does it function through history and through story and through this layer of universal history. I just started taking a look again at Tolkien's fairy stories and looking at Tom Holland, thinking about the end of modernity and the end of postmodernity and what all of this means, sort of keeping Chris Kavanaugh and his complaints in the back of my mind. And so I wanted to do a live stream today, and I wanted to talk about the Grail. So these are the guys that I invited in. And so here we are. And I thought,
check it out, Paul. It does in fact show up.
I was hoping for a big black eye.
It looks a lot worse in person. The camera kind of like, I don't know, makes it less. Yeah. I don't even know when it happened, how it happened.
Really?
Oh, well, I was doing jiu-jitsu this morning, so it happened at some time in that. But
sometime during, but you don't.
We had some very hard rounds this morning, and Like I rolled with like a 6'7", 350-pound linebacker from OSU and an MMA fighter, and those weren't even the hardest rounds that I had this morning. So like it was just people were just going, yeah. It was
6'7",
people
350
were
is a
going
big
ham.
dude.
So I don't know when this happened. It happened sometime this morning between the hours of 6 and 7 a.m. But
So Richard mentioned that on Twitter, and I said, if you show up with a big black shiner, you're going to break the internet in the symbolic world. Because
it feels like more of an abrasion than it does an actual bruise. But I think the bruising is going to come. It's tenor. I think the bruising will show tomorrow.
I'm going to ask the comment section: is Richard's sound a little low? Because it sounds a little low to me. How about you, Nate? Does Richard sound okay to you?
I'm getting him okay.
Uno momento. Hold on. I had the wrong
Let me move my mic closer too.
microphone plugged in.
Maybe I'm just getting old and hard of hearing. So Chad says. Okay. So what Mrs. Davis did for me, thanks to Bishop Barron, was by no means give me a vision of the Catholic ideal of female orders being married to Jesus. That is not what that show gave to me. What the show gave to me was a question about what on earth is this Grail and how is it functioning? Because Mrs. Davis was a Grail story. Now, Richard hasn't watched Mrs. Davis. Nate and I've talked about it a little bit. You sort of have the same.
I did go out and like read some spoilers because like some people are like really against spoilers. I am a big fan of spoilers as a medievalist. I think spoilers are like it's a trap from the elites to make you waste time by watching things you don't want to watch. So I just went out and looked up some spoilers and I was like, holy crap, man, that's like 50. Like if it's even 50% that bad, like I'm not gonna watch this. It's just not gonna happen.
But to me, that it was the Grail thing that hooked me, because even though the point of the show was to destroy the Grail, which I thought was fascinating,
Did you actually think they would though?
I was unsure until the end. That was the cliffhanger.
I did not. And when I discovered that was the actual intent, that they were actually going to go through with the idea of destroying the Grail, that's when I became appalled. I actually can follow Bishop Barron up to the point. I can follow Bishop Barron up to a point as seeing the sexy Jesus as a metaphor, because it is all happening. I mean, it's all happening in Simone's head, right? It's in her prayers. And I can see it as a way of portraying the nun as a bride of Christ, but then they pushed that too far to the point where he should have got off board on that train. But I mean, up to a point, like I can see like watching it early on and be like, oh, like this is not theologically correct, but this is an interesting way of portraying the nun as a bride of Christ, even though it's done in this very literalistic fashion, but it can still be read as a metaphor. So I can follow him up to that point. But, like, when did you not realize that this train was going completely off the rails? Like, it's like, okay, so I have, like, a little bit of indulgence toward the bishop, like, early on. But there should have been a point where you realize this was, like, not just problematic, but diabolical.
Yes. No,
Yeah,
that's right.
I mean, can I just spoil a little bit here?
You spoil all you want.
Prevent other people from wasting their time. Okay, so as I understand it, having just read spoilers and not actually seen the show, the Grail is supposed to be the skull of Jesus Christ, which Mary saved after the crucifixion because she wanted something for him to something of him to remember him by, and so she saves the skull, and then this causes him to be trapped in the state, like in limbo, like the state between life and death. So actually the Jesus we've all been worshiping all along is actually just caught in this place between life and death. And they need to destroy the skull so that Jesus can move on, and therefore we can as well. Right? That
is, I mean, a really close watching, paying close attention. Most people watching will probably be a little vague on all of the particulars and just, I mean, again, low resolution, it'll be the Grail is bad. It needs to die. Sister Simone's mission is to rid the world of the evil Grail.
Yep.
And then all those details fill it in.
Right.
And it's crazy.
It is crazy. I mean, in some ways it is in some ways it is a very well made show. It is interesting. It's captivating. I mean, it's certainly good at getting your attention.
But to me,
it's very witty. It has some elements that are like good, but it uses them all for evil purposes.
Well, and so that then brought into focus for me the way that the Grail seems to function in our imaginary as a revelatory thing, because your posture towards the Grail, which obviously Mrs. Davis has a specific posture towards the Grail, which reveals the evil of the show. And I'm a complete Grail neophyte.
And that evil, by the way, like, is fully revealed through the words of Mary and the intentions of Mary, which makes it all the more awful.
I didn't mean to wear my Repping Mary t-shirt today. It was just a clean t-shirt that I had.
This happened on Grizz's show too. That, oh, by the way, I didn't mean to wear this t-shirt.
I don't remember what t-shirt I wore for his show, but I mean, these are just like these are most of the t-shirts I own are things like this. So it's better than zero chance of it happening.
But it's providential. I mean, okay. Yeah. I mean, Providence isn't a domain strictly of the Calvinists here. So
I suppose we could, like, the Protestants could just read it as a Revelation chapter 12 shirt without determining who's depicted. But
yes,
if you resist the obvious conclusion, you're just silly.
Ambiguous woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it.
Because we have no idea who that is. It could be anyone.
Yeah, but
all right. Let's backtrack here and start with. Now, Nate has I remember when Nate's channel appeared named Grail Country, and to me that was, that's interesting.
I every time I saw the channel come up before I actually watched one of his videos, I was like, this is going to be like Arthurian, like country music, like a Johnny Cash ballad style, retelling of the Grail story, which I would be 100% down for. In fact, somebody make that happen.
So I want us first to, for those who, like me, are complete neophytes in terms of this and maybe haven't watched Jonathan and Richard's take on the Grail, haven't listened to the Richard, did you hear Tom Holland's
no.
The rest is history on that? Okay, so
I'm still feuding with Tom Holland over something.
Really?
And it's really old. There was a mistake in one of his books, and I may be the only person that noticed it, and he's quite a lovely person, and I shouldn't hold it against him. But like every time I think about it, I'm just like, oh. But
there's
anyway,
a mistake in most books. There's lots of mistakes in most books.
This one was pretty egregious to me as a Latin scholar and as a medievalist. But anyway, no, I haven't watched it yet. I actually haven't. I mean, since I stopped driving to work, my podcast listening time is greatly reduced. So yeah, but I'll get to it. I just haven't got to it yet.
Okay, so let's first have a little bit of introduction to the Grail, and I'm sure you two are going to have some differences of opinion on some things. I don't care who of you wants to go first.
I don't think anything that Richard has said is wrong. I just think he stopped short. It's incomplete.
Well, this is why.
Go ahead then. I don't know where I'm incomplete, so I'd love to hear.
So Nate, okay, Nate, you named your whole channel after the Grail. So tell us about the Grail.
So for me, I think Bulgakov is the person who really nails the essence of the Grail.
Okay, but that doesn't help anyone.
No, I know it's not. I'm actually because I just have like, this is the one little short section I decided that I wanted to if I got the opportunity.
I had my Bulgakov book in this bag, and I don't know where it went.
Okay.
But I did find the water bottle I was looking for.
So this is just a short little paragraph from page 43 of the Holy Grail in the Eucharist. And he says, we thus arrive at the unexpected conclusion that Christ, who ascended to heaven and departed the world, abides in the world in his blood and water. He's writing this as an exegesis of John 19:34. And he points out that it falls to the earth. And he abides not mystically, as in the Eucharistic elements, secretly and visibly to human eyes, but essentially and really, by virtue of his incarnation, his entering into the world. Christ abides on the earth without departing from us. However, he abides not in his personal mode, which is manifest and accessible to all, but in his earthly humanity. Christ remains with us on the earth in his blood and water, and this abiding was taken away from the earth, neither by the resurrection nor the ascension in glory. The abiding is not a sacrament, for sacraments, despite all their mysteriousness, are always known, since they are linked to a definite place and time. Rather, this abiding is a mystery, the world's great holy divine mystery, the world's treasure, holiness, and glory, the Holy Grail. This mystery is preserved and revealed in the life of the Church, and not only in the past life of the Church in its present and future, but also in its present and future life. It is not surprising if this mystery, till now, is still not illuminated by the theological dogmatic consciousness, has lived only in the obscure presentiments of Christian legend and poetry, in which the holy myth is clouded by human imaginings and romantic reveries. But at the appropriate time, this mystery can take center stage in the Christian world's consciousness. And then the holy treasure of Montserrat will catch fire with heavenly light and will lead the nations to meet the coming Christ. The whole world is the Holy Grail, for it has received into itself and contains Christ's precious blood and water. The whole world is the chalice of Christ's blood and water. The whole world partook of them in the communion at the hour of Christ's death, and the whole world hides the blood and water within itself. A drop of Christ's blood dropped upon Adam's head and redeemed Adam, but also all the blood and water of Christ that flowed forth into the world sanctified the world. This blood and water made the world a place of the presence of Christ's power, prepared the world for its future transfiguration, for the meeting of Christ's coming glory. The world was not deprived of Christ's presence. I will not leave you comfortless. Christ is not alien to the world. The world lives by Christ's power. The world has become Christ, for it is the holy chalice, the Holy Grail. The world has become indestructible and incorruptible, for in Christ's blood and water it has received the power of incorruption, which will be manifested in its transfiguration. The world is already paradise, for it has produced the tri-blessed tree on which Christ was crucified. So, Richard is absolutely right in that what's going on is Eucharistic, but the Grail, the reason the Grail is told the way it is, through as poem, as legend, as myth, is because it is hinting toward the mystery of the cosmic Eucharist. So it's not we can't merely confine what's going on in the Grail stories to just the sacramental Eucharist. That's where I would say, like, yes, but it's more than that.
Okay.
At the same time.
What you did there, Nate, was beautiful. But what you have failed to appreciate is the benefit of an introduction for people who have read less than 1,000 books and have an IQ less than 135.
Sure.
We need to start in a much more simple place.
So it's really okay. So I'll start where Bulgakov starts. Bulgakov, this comes out of his exegesis of John 19:34, right? So he's saying, so he talks a lot about the symbolism of blood and water. I won't get into that part. But the very simple part for what the passage I just read, what you need to grasp here is that it's Christ's blood and water when it comes out of his side, it hits the earth. I actually noticed something a while back. It's very interesting.
Now, maybe before we go there, do we want to actually explain like what even is the Holy Grail? Like,
yes.
I think that's where Paul's trying to go.
Sorry, I just took that.
No, yes, that's where
Actually, I have a perfect image that actually will reinforce what I was just talking about and suggest that. So, I don't know if you guys, let's see, hold this up to the camera. This is my personal rosary, and I didn't notice this when I first got it. But if you notice there, let's see if I can get it in the frame.
You have to put it right in the middle because
right at the bottom
yeah,
of it. At the bottom of it, you'll notice there's a chalice. Right? So there's actually, which I didn't know. I didn't notice it until I've been using it for a long time because I'm not a super observant person. But there's actually an image of the Grail right there on my rosary. And so the Grail is, it's most often represented as a chalice. It's a complicated question when you ask what is the Grail, because as Richard and I both know, there are lots of different versions of the Grail, and the Grail is depicted in different ways in different versions of the Grail story. But the most common enduring image is the chalice image. Like, that's the one that's kind of captivated our consciousness.
Right.
So that's the most enduring image. So it's a cup, and it's the cup that again, the most enduring and popular version of the legend. It contains the blood of Christ that was collected by Joseph of Arimathea.
And I think helpful to understanding this is the reality that something cosmic, like you just described, in the imaginary gets still distilled down to something that humble folk love to live with in their universal history. I'll say it that way. And so I think it's rather than just taking trying to describe the cosmic, I think the genius of this and the beauty of this is that it becomes, and this is what I think symbolism is supposed to do.
Yeah.
It makes the cosmic real.
I mean, this is
scalable. Go ahead,
This
Richard.
is why it's even dangerous, I think, to talk about. Forgive me, Nate, but you just used the phrase "just the sacrament of the Eucharist" or something like that. And I was like, "There's nothing just about it, right?" But it's because it's layered so closely in with the incarnation. It's layered so closely in with this whole idea that is fundamental to any understanding of, let's call it, pre-modern Christianity, East or West or whatever, which is that created matter is good, and then it has the capability of mediating grace, right? Sacraments, the things that, like the list of the 7 sacraments in the West or something like that, maybe do this in like really specific ways, whereas but all matter does this. All matter is intended to do this. This is why this is the function of creation, right? Is so one of the things Father Alexander Schmemann always made a big deal of was that it's not what we're doing in a sacrament is actually showing creation for what it actually is, right? Revealing it as actually a theophany, right? This is what the world is supposed to be. And sort of by abdicating our priestly responsibilities in Eden, right, we sort of failed to reveal the world in this way. Mm-hmm. But just for people who are out there who are like kind of like new to like what is all the Grail stuff about. So around the year 1000 to 1400, we have these legends that start appearing in Western Europe, and they have to do with something called the Grail. And the Grail is this really, really elusive thing. Basically, it's a liturgical object, either an altar or a bell, or a chalice, or sometimes a patens, which is kind of a liturgical plate that you would put bread on for the Eucharist. But it's a liturgical object. And legends start sort of appearing around it. It starts showing up, for instance, in the Pyrenees, shortly after the right around the same time as the Third and Fourth Crusades. Starts showing up in the Pyrenees as this image of the Virgin Mary holding a Grail, holding a chalice with sort of flames coming out of it in her hands. And the image starts showing up there. It shows up in like Celtic hagiography, like and sort of like, say, like wonder tales or miracle legends. And then it also shows up, ultimately it starts showing up in the troubadour tradition of the medieval romance. So romance means like an adventure story. And the troubadours were sort of this group of people who were kind of lived on the border of let's say not old world, new world, but the border of basically the Mediterranean and then Western Europe, right, which was the old world, new world back then, right? And so you had these people who came kind of from basically like the French Mediterranean kind of area, and they're picking up legends, they're picking up stuff that's coming back from the Crusades, they're picking up on all of these things, but then they're coming to France, mainly France, but then ultimately other places in Europe, because some of the troubadours were actually kings of like founders of fairly important dynasties, and so all of their kids sort of inherited this stuff. When they so you'd have somebody who's like a poet and a singer, but also a crusader, but also, you know, the king of France, right? And so they come and they start disseminating these legends via basically epic poems or songs that were composed in the vernacular, which was kind of a big deal because all the really prestigious literature at the time is written in Latin. So to have somebody come on and actually, you know, this is ultimately the tradition that Dante, like his group, the Sweet New Style, which is the best rap group name, but like his group, he was part of this group of poets called the Sweet New Style, and they were basically doing epic stories and romances and things like this in provincial Latin, right? But even before them, though, you have the Arthurian stuff started to circulate. And the interesting thing about the Holy Grail myths is that they don't necessarily originate with King Arthur, but they very quickly get caught up into the Arthurian cycle, because the Arthurian cycle was the I'm going to resist the urge to say it was the MCU of the Middle Ages, because I hate it when people say that. But I mean, the Arthurian story was basically this. I mean, most Arthurian legends are not legends about King Arthur. The oldest ones are and the oldest ones are things like King Arthur is fighting giants and becoming emperor of the Romans and stuff like this. But like most Arthurian stories are not actually about King Arthur. They're about things happening in his court. It was sort of the container, just like Charlemagne's court in the matter of France, right? It's sort of the container where all these legendary people would be gathered. And actually, most of the important Arthurian stories are written by French people. Most of the important Charlemagne stories are written by Italian people, right? For something to be legendary, it's because it happened over there, right? Yeah. So anyway, all that to say, the myth of the Holy Grail very quickly starts getting kind of mixed and matched into the Arthurian stuff. And when it does so, there are some early versions. Chrétien de Troyes' Percival, which is my favorite version. It's the one that I've done, several videos with Jonathan Pageau on. If people want to go watch those, is really the earliest. But then the one that the one that most people remember is Sir Robert de Boron's Grail epic, which basically is the first place that solidifies the idea that it's this cup, and that it's the cup that Christ used at the Last Supper, right? And so which was then later used to catch the water and blood that streamed from his side at the crucifixion, right? And basically that's how you get to Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, and that's how you get to almost every version of the Grail epic that we've gotten since then is kind of based off of that. And there were a bunch of later Arthurian stuff. Just to say a couple of quick things about the Grail, there may be three things that most Grail stories have in common, regardless of who wrote them or when they were written. And the first thing is that the Grail has a feminine association. It's usually carried by a virgin. It's carried by a woman. It's sort of feminine in the sense that it's like a container. It's a receptacle. It's a place for manifesting body, right? So the Grail always has this kind of feminine connotation, and usually, like in the visions in the Grail chapels in the Arthurian myths, it's being carried. The Grail itself is being carried by a young woman. The second thing to know about the Grail is that it's extremely elusive. right? The whole thing with the Grail is that you get really, really close, but you don't get to, like, maybe you get a vision, but you never quite attain it. In fact, the only person who actually does attain it, although again, see my video on Percival, because my whole argument is Percival actually does attain the Grail, but
in a particular way.
In a particular way, right?
And the story bears that shape.
Right, yeah. But there's a later, in the later version of the much later, as when it comes along as part of the Lancelot, what in French, in Arthurian studies is called the Lancelot Grail cycle. Eventually, it's Sir Lancelot's son Galahad. He's the only one who actually attains the Grail, and basically because of this, he has to leave the world. Right. So there's something about the Grail. It's like, well, if you got it, then you're no longer, you're sort of like too holy. You're sort of like, like, in other words, to attain the Grail is kind of death, right? A saintly death, but it's death. And then the last thing to sort of say about the Grail is that in all of its forms, it's connected to basically the idea of the body of Christ, right? His body, and then even more specifically, his blood. There was probably, we don't want to get into all of this, but in the Middle Ages there was a cult, not a like, woo spooky cult, but like cultus in the sense of like devotion, right? There was a cult in the West of the holy blood, and actually this shows up, for instance, in a lot of French and English heraldry, where sometimes if you look at the coats of arms of, like, noble houses or whatnot, you'll see there are like these 3 red drops of blood, right? There are actually kind of little references to the 3 drops of blood in the Percival story as well. But there was this cult of the holy blood, and this basically, like having a devotion to the blood of Christ. This is part of a larger set of devotions to what's sometimes called the vulnerary of Christ, that is his wounds. And this is the like the Ur source, for instance, of like the Sacred Heart devotion today. So anyway, all that to say, this was a very popular devotion. In fact, devotional books for lay people would very often have like, here's a page that's just the exact dimensions of the side wound of Christ, so you could meditate on that. Or and obviously there are certain famous churches in in Western Europe today which actually still purport to have the blood of Christ. If you've ever seen the delightful family-friendly film In Bruges, you'll know what I'm talking about. But anyway, please don't actually show that to your children. So anyway,
but you should watch it because it's a darn good movie.
It's a darn good movie, but it's not family friendly at all. But actually, like, the blood of Christ is like has an important role to play in that film. But anyway, so all of this to say, one of the things that I thought was very interesting about the Mrs. Davis, at least as far as like kind of reading, again, just like reading the summary of it, is that they basically have all of the parts of the symbolism there, but then it's demonically inverted. And this is the thing that really freaked me out, right? Of course, there's a connection between Mary and the Grail.
Yes.
Right. Of course, there's a feminine connection with the Grail, right? Of course, in
fact, the Grail almost like that's almost one of the best ways of understanding the Grail, is that the Grail, at some level, is representing the mystery of the divine feminine, which is why it is a mystery and why it's hidden.
And the mystery of
correct. Yes.
And then which is also the body of Christ, right? And then you have the this connection to the body, right? It's actually the skull of Jay or whatever, right?
Because apparently Mary is like a Scythian tribes person who drinks out of skull cups.
And then you have this idea that if you attain it, you die. But in this case, what they're trying to do is attain it, which in this case means destroy it. So what? So Jesus can die, right? So instead of here is a way that God is sort of being revealed, he's being made manifest in the world, and the Grail kind of represents this sort of this ephemeral theophany. Like you get really close and then it slips from your grasp again, but you're constantly pursuing, right? That's the thing. You're constantly pursuing. What are you pursuing? You're pursuing communion with God. You're pursuing knowledge of Him, right? And it goes from that to being a quest to actually get out of communion with God. It goes to being this quest to, how can I attain this thing so I can destroy it, so God can move on with His life and I can move on with mine.
Well, it's
And
not
that's
even
the thing that freaked me out.
right. And Jesus is not God in this
Well, yes,
in this
right, yeah.
show.
No.
Yeah.
And I think in many ways it's an atheistic in
Yes.
that it sort of echoes New Atheism, because the idea behind it is, if we can get rid of God, the world will be better, because the Grail is nothing but trouble. And so,
and isn't it interesting that it's the AI who's like, here's the bargain. You make God go away and I'll go away too.
yes.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it's sort of an inversion of, the Grail is sort of Tolkien's ring in some ways in Mrs. Davis.
Yeah.
And it has to be thrown into the fires of Mount
Yeah.
Doom.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Right.
And also
Right.
it's
And given the inevitable connection between the Grail and the church, it's
association with selfishness, right? I think that at some point the boss, who turns out to be, Jesus's ogreish mother or whatever, that she says that the Grail was created by selfishness, so it has to be destroyed by selflessness. So like the Grail, which should be this presence of Christ's selfless self-giving of himself, right? Which is what happens in the Eucharist, which is what happens in communion, right? There's no just the sacrament of the Eucharist to me, again, because, and
there is if you have a Western mind that has reduced what the fullness of the meaning of the sacrament is.
Yes. Well, but setting that aside, like this is the ultimate selfless self-giving of himself, right? And this is what all the Grail Knights, this is basically what they have to, if you look at the trials that the various Grail Knights have to go through in the different versions of the story, Tennyson's are actually some of my favorite, right? But they have to undergo being, tempted in all these different ways. What? Tempted by the world, right? Tempted by the passions, tempted by themselves. And they have to reject all of those things to get to the Grail, right? And this is the flip side. It's, let me destroy the Grail so I can get together with my ex, and so that I can have my this, and so that I can, and it's just like very much diabolical symbolism, in the sense that let's take all the Christian, like all this Christian symbolic language, and let's just turn it on its head.
Yeah. So
do you think, I have to ask,
ahead,
do you think it was done consciously, or do you think just the inversion happened because of the whatever of the just the basic impulses of the screenwriter?
Is there a difference? Because that I think is in some ways the power of the Grail, in that it is revelatory, and how the Grail is used in this story reveals, in my opinion, a spirit in this age.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm not going to call it the spirit of this age. We might call it the spirit of the air. But a spirit in this age is revealed by how the Grail functions in that story.
Right.
Which I think was an immensely powerful idea in terms of understanding the Grail, because there was this great, so when Ross Douthat had Eric Weinstein on his podcast.
Is that how you say his last name?
Douthat.
Okay.
Yes.
Cool.
It is. I never did. I got corrected on that years ago.
Wondered.
What?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Douthat.
Okay,
So actually it was the other ways. When Eric Weinstein had Ross Douthat on his podcast, Eric asked Ross, if Jesus was around today, don't you think he'd just be memed into oblivion? But I think what you see is in Christ, and I think even in a sense in the Grail, because people are trying to meme this thing, but there's a level of truth that, in a sense, there's no weapon formed against it will stand. And I actually see that in this Mrs. Davis thing, because it is, by using the Grail, in a sense, the story is revealed to be what it is, and so that to me was tremendously fascinating, because the question is, well, if Jesus was around today, would he just sort of be memed into oblivion? And I thought, well, first of all, if you know the story, the worst thing that they could do was, portray him as an insurgent and then treat him as such. And then the point of the resurrection is, no, even that won't work. And this is part of why I think we see the enduring nature of Christ in all of this mystery and majesty, that you just can't kill him. I mean, it's Chesterton's observation that he seems to know the way out of the tomb, like he knows the way out of being memed to death. And so then when I saw Mrs. Davis, and I went back and listened to a bunch of these things about the Grail, especially Richard, how you portrayed it in terms of, why don't you talk a little bit about what you talked in the video about, because Tom Holland sort of saw it, as many do, that he never attains the Grail. But I think you nailed it. And I think that's, in fact, how the Grail functions.
Yeah, so at the very end of Percival's story, this is a 1,000-foot summary. If you get in there, there's a lot of really cool details, but you can go watch the video if you want to. At the end of Percival's life, so basically he gets to the Grail, and this is the other thing that I should have mentioned about Grail symbolism, is that the Grail always prompts you to ask a question. Sort of is a question, or is the answer to a question. Well, Percival doesn't know what the question is. So when he's in the Grail Chapel, he fails to ask the question. And as a result, there's like a voice from heaven, and like everybody's gone, and like it's terrible. And then he forgets who he is. He loses his name. He loses his identity. He wanders through the wilderness for 5 years, and all this stuff. And finally, he gets to the sort of the end of his story. And which, by the way, this poem isn't just about him. Most Arthurian stories are using what's a narrative technique called interlace, where you tell 3 or 4 unrelated stories, and they just or seemingly unrelated stories, and they just cross over at various points in time, and in the end, you kind of see everything come back together. But but the Percival portions of the story. Percival has forgotten his name. He's wandering through the wilderness, kind of doing knightly things, but with no purpose, no memory of who he is, no identity. And then finally, he comes across these lords and ladies, and they say, "Hey, what are you doing there? Going in armor, right, on today of all days? You're not allowed. It's unlawful." And Percival says, "What's today?" And they say, "Well, it's Good Friday. It's the day that Jesus Christ died." And of course, one of the important parts of the symbolism of the story is that Percival has never been properly catechized, and so he's really even never been to church, which is one of the important details, little subtle details in the story. So he says, "Well, it's the day that Jesus Christ died," and Percival's like, "I have no idea what you're talking about." And so they said, "Okay, well, go down that way. And when you go far enough down this path, you'll get to a hermit, and you go to that hermit, and that hermit will tell you everything that you need to know." And so Percival goes to the hermit, and the hermit, essentially, a few things happen. The hermit reveals Percival's name to him. He reveals his own identity as basically Percival's uncle, which heals there's like a loss of fatherhood is one of the major themes in the story. So Percival's like lost fatherhood is sort of restored to him here, and then Percival is catechized, and it actually runs through like very explicitly in the text. Here are the things, and it's just basically presenting the gospel. This is who Jesus was. This is what he did. And then at the very end, he says, "Stay with me for the next 3 days." Well, this is Holy Friday, so you do the math. right? He says, "Stay with me for 3 days, and eat what I eat." Well, if you know anything about monastic practice in the Middle Ages, you know that "eat what I eat" basically means you don't really eat almost anything at all except a little bread and a little water, right? So stay with me, eat what I eat for the next 3 days. So the very last thing that's said about Percival in the whole story is he stays with the hermit, he eats what he eats, and on the third day, he confessed his sins, and he received communion. And then the story says, and we will say no more of Percival in this story. Now, there was other stuff in there. There's an ending for Gawain, his character in that poem, which Chrétien died before he could finish. So we don't know how Gawain's story is supposed to end, but according to what Chrétien wrote, that's the end of Percival's story. So actually, the sort of like the losing the Grail and forgetting who you are, and then coming to church and remembering, that is the Grail story, right? That is the Grail story. It's like being presented with this question. To go back to the Bulgakov quote, you could say the story of Adam is being presented with the world as sacrament, being presented with the world as a theophany, right? A revelation of God. This is what, I mean, you don't have to go to Bulgakov for this. You can go to St. Maximus, right? He talks about this, Adam naming the animals.
Which is where Bulgakov is.
Right, yeah, I'm just saying, this goes way back. This goes way back. And revealing the sort of the world in this way. And in that sense, like, it's actually the same thing for the blood of Christ to drip down on the skull of Adam, which is this sort of ancient Christian legend. This is why Golgotha is the place of the skull, because there's a really old Jewish legend predating Christianity that's the burial place of Adam after the flood. And so this idea that the blood trickles down on the skull, right, that renews Adam. But to renew Adam is actually to renew the world. This is why St. Paul says that creation is groaning in travail, like a woman in childbirth, right? Waiting what? Waiting for the fulfillment, the consummation, the revelation of the sons of God. Father Dimitri Staniloae, in his wonderful, wonderful chapters on the resurrection, this is exactly what he talks about, that in the moment of the resurrection of the body, right, the resurrection of the dead, that creation itself will be transfigured like Christ's garments, like the terrain around him was transformed at the moment of the transfiguration, and everything will kind of be revealed in that moment for being what it is, right? But so Adam is supposed to basically like see the world in this way, and he fails to do that, right? That's Percival's failure is Adam's fall, right? It's the failure to really grasp the world in this way. And instead, what's the thing that why doesn't Percival ask the question? I mean, this is an important part of the story as well. Percival doesn't ask the question because he's already been told by people he considers wise and important. He's been told, don't ask questions, you'll look stupid. Well, what's the thing that Adam, why do they eat the fruit, right? It's for knowledge, right? We don't want to be babies anymore. We want to, I know there's more to it than this, but it's, a big part of it is we don't want to be babies anymore. We want to, be like God, know good and evil. And
we want to be seen to be like God.
Yeah, right. Yes, yeah. That's an important distinction. For sure.
Yeah, you don't want to appear ignorant.
Yeah, right. And so Adam and Eve, right, they eat the fruit, they fall, right? And so then the rest of life becomes this constant, like, getting really close. You have all these theophanies throughout the Old Testament, right? These times when God comes close to us, but it's like we can never get it right. It's always eluding us, right? And so what's needed ultimately, right, is the incarnation, right? And that's where the feminine aspect of the Grail comes in, right? God has a body, giving God a body, right? And all that stuff is involved. But anyway, so just to say, I think Percival does get the Grail at the end of the story, right? But it's in a kind of a subtle way, and I think to me it's actually much more compelling than the later version of the story where, like, the Grail Knight, whoever the Grail Knight is, it kind of changes. Eventually it becomes Galahad.
Galahad's boring.
Yeah, Galahad is like the hot new thing.
Galahad is like a Christian superhero. He's totally boring.
Well, I mean, I think some of the Galahad stories are actually quite amusing.
I
but-
know. I love Malcolm Guyton. He's a Galahad guy, but Galahad.
I think Galahad. I think some of the Galahad stories are quite fun, but also like the very like the fairy tale timeline on like, okay, exactly how old is Lancelot, because he's got a full grown son running, but anyway, so but to me, this version of the story, which is you do get the Grail, but what does getting the Grail mean? It means like you got to go do what any 6-year-old kid would do, right? That's the thing, and that's the proper inversion, right? The proper inversion, which is an inversion of the self, which is a humbling of the self, right? As opposed to the sort of like, now I've achieved the Grail and now I'm too good for this world, I have to be taken away. Like, there's something to that. I'm not saying that's like a wrong idea or like not a legitimate Christian symbol or anything like that, but the sort of the subtle way that this is handled, and there's a lot more to the Percival story, which I didn't even get to in that video. I have a book that someday maybe I'll finish, but it's like my crazy like conspiracy theory pin pins and string and everything on the wall. Like it's that project for me. But what I would say is that if you pay close attention to Percival's story, the arc is very, very, it's just very subtly done. And if you pay attention to naming the story, if you pay attention to clothing, removing new garments, putting old garments, putting new ones on, right? There's this whole thing early on in the first half of the story, for instance, that has to do with Percival basically getting power-ups. He gets progressively like better suits of armor because he kills people and he takes their armor, right? But then actually the thing he has to, and that's part of his maturity, is he's moving up the hierarchy of society. Is he gets these better suits of armor, he gets these new cloaks, all this stuff. But then when he gets to the very end of the story, he has to take it all off, and he goes back to wearing the basically the sackcloth, that he'd started the story in, right? Because he started out, he was poor, he was a savage, he didn't know anything, etc. And he's got to be stripped of all of those things so that he can come to the Grail.
It's that connection between the child and the sage.
Yeah.
Well,
it's a really powerful story.
And I really loved how you worked that, Richard. And when I saw that, I had a much better understanding of what the Grail is, how it functions in these stories, how it reveals. And then when I listened to it, I thought, I'm thinking about sort of the transition, why the Grail, and Tom Holland works on this a little bit. I don't think he gets it quite right, but I think it's why the Grail appears when it does. I think it has a lot to do with this process that will lead to modernity, obviously around the time of the Protestant Reformation. But the Protestant Reformation is an instantiation of this.
It's the
one of the things I know that
for phrasing it this way, but it's the symptom. It's the like the world is headed in a certain direction, and that makes it possible for the Reformation to happen the way that it happens. Right. Like
Go ahead.
Western Church had plenty of reforms before that moment that didn't fracture in that way. Right.
And I think an interesting contrast to these Grail legends, especially as you've sort of laid them out, Richard, would be, say, Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. When you sort of put those things next to each other, a whole bunch of very interesting things sort of becomes illuminated on a lot of different levels.
Yeah.
Storytelling, development of storytelling. Because, when you understand at least your interpretation of, did Percival achieve the Grail? Yes. But what you don't see is a picture of him standing it with his hand or any of this nonsense that's going on in the Indiana Jones movie.
Yeah.
Because that is a failure to simply understand storytelling and how you can use these stories, these, what are we going to call them? Universal mythology, universal history stories, fairy stories, legends, how you can understand how these stories communicate the ineffable. I mean, the whole point is, all gospel preaching, if I can switch into a Protestant metaphor here, is to communicate the ineffable, that thing that the angels can't get enough of looking at, into flesh. And that then obviously it's in the incarnation, it's in Christian conversion. I mean, the point of it is to, here I want to show you what the gospel is about. Let me tell you a story about, and there's a grail in it. And of course, today we think about what would that be about? But of course, Bunyan is going to use a very different situation.
Yeah, I think that the impact, mostly for ill, of Pilgrim's Progress on storytelling is difficult to underestimate. I really struggle with this as like a Western literary tradition appreciator, like, well, obviously you gotta read Pilgrim's Progress. Like you gotta read it to understand things that are going on in England at the time and all this different stuff. But then like also, man, even, okay, so when you did your first video on Mrs. Davis, or maybe it was your only one, I don't know. Anyway, when I watched it,
I did a first one and a second one, and
still
continuing to evolve. Obviously,
one I watched, I don't know, but anyway, whichever one I watched. When I watched your video, I think it was your first one because you were responding to Bishop Barron, and and you were responding to him talking about like the intimacy between like a religious sister and Christ, and like, I gotta say, there's something about all of that really wigs me out. And this is not just my modern WASP sensibilities have been shocked, et cetera, et cetera. Even like from a pre-modern, standpoint, from an Orthodox standpoint, whatever, like that stuff wigs me out. And it's not because there isn't language, even in the scriptures itself, like of divine eros, right?
Yeah.
I have no problem with that. But what everybody should know, and yet, thanks in part to Bunyan, like we've kind of, I'll try to explain the connection in a minute because maybe it's not immediately obvious. But what everybody should know is that there are some kinds of intimacy which it is simply not appropriate to air in a public forum, right? It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that language isn't there, right? It doesn't mean that we're not always the bride to Christ bridegroom, right? It doesn't mean that language is completely inappropriate because obviously you've got the Song of Songs and you've got, other stuff in the Christian mystical tradition, but like you can't show it on TV, man. Like you can't uncover the mystery, right? And this goes back to like the whole thing of the Grail is, right, that is this mystery, and part of that mystery is the divine feminine, which is the church, and part of that mystery is like intimacy and all those different things, and that's why the Grail is covered. Like even in the Orthodox Church, when we bring the chalice out, we cover it, like the whole, the whole idea of like, and I am not trying to pick on anybody, so I hope people will hear this in good faith, but just from an Orthodox standpoint, to take the Eucharist and put it in a monstrance and then let's go on a parade is like, bro, like it's a little shocking. Why? Because we have this impulse to cover a mystery, right? That and
so it's Richard. It's interesting. I know you're not a fan. I know you're not a fan of A.E. Waite, but one of the things that Waite does suggest.
I'm not a fan of Waite.
Oh, okay.
He's a little wacky. I like Mackin better than Waite, but I
believe Waite actually suggests at one point, if I'm recalling, that one of the potential sources of inspiration for the Grail stories coming into the West when they did is observation of the Eastern Rite.
Yeah, that's his kind of main argument. So Waite's, for people to know, A.E. Waite was sort of a British like occultist, spiritualist, kind of Christian mystic, but like kind of, let's say, played around with like some circles that make me a little itchy. And
he was a Christian hermeticist.
To put it mildly, but Waite, a big part of his argument is that the Grail is, the Grailness, or at least the Celtic Grailness, are the survival of like a missing Celtic epiclesis. So the epiclesis is the moment in Eastern liturgies when the Holy Spirit is called down upon the gifts and we ask God to change them, right? And this is something that's a feature of Eastern liturgies. It's not really a feature of surviving Western liturgies, but Waite thought that there maybe was one that had been in like the old kind of Celtic mass that was obliterated by, and a lot of people thought this, not just Waite, but that was like, you know, anyway, long story short, yeah, he says that, but he says that maybe one of the sources of the Grail is is Crusaders or whoever having come back, having observed Eastern liturgies, and there's no way this isn't true. By the way, like there's no way that is not a part of things. I mean, in our videos with Pajot, I went into a lot of detail about the connection between like the Holy Face of the Blacarenite Church and the Great Entrance and the Divine Liturgy and all these different things. Like that's definitely a part. I would never say that's the only thing, because it's like the thing about the Grail is because it's a container, right? It actually attracts origin stories and they become true. So it's like, anyway, but anyway, all that to say, there is what is sometimes called the Byzantine school of Grail studies, and it's people just looking at connections between the Grail legends and like Eastern liturgies, and so that's definitely
that can't be the full explanation, because as you just went through a painstaking effort to explain earlier, the person holding the Grail object is always a woman.
Right. Yeah.
So that makes it impossible for it to be a 1-to-1 representation.
Yeah.
Of
No.
Byzantine
It's
rite.
not. It's not 1-to-1. It's more like, yeah. It's not like that. It's not 1-to-1. But that 1-to-1 approach is. Sorry, kids are yelling. That 1-to-1 approach is exactly what Bunyan did for symbolic storytelling. And this is where I loop back around to.
Okay.
This is my axe to grind.
Okay.
Right? Is that the Grail always eludes being a 1-to-1. So if I just said, well, the Grail is just 1-to-1, you know, the Byzantine Divine Liturgy or whatever, then, but it won't do that, right? And you can do the same thing with, the Grail is just these Celtic myths.
It wouldn't be a mystery, as Bulgakov points out. Like, right?
Yeah,
it happened.
Yeah, the Grail is just these Celtic myths that got Christianized, but it won't do that, right? Like it's more than it's more than any kind of a reductive reading could try to make it. And but what Bunyan did was to take the quest narrative, but to sort of like give everything a very bald 1-to-1 correspondence, and to sort of like to eliminate the mystery, right? So then it's like, okay, so you're in the dungeon of giant despair, but you have a key called hope, and it opens all locks. Well, okay, there's nothing else for me to think about now. Like, thanks for explaining all of that. And in this sense, Bunyan he's not inventing something new. He's kind of picking up from like some of the worst medieval authors, people nobody remembers because their stories were boring. But then it just becomes like sort of this linchpin of what we as modern people are going to come to mean by symbolism, right? And this is why it's so darn hard to like explain this to like your evangelical grandma or something like this, and you're like, well, grandma, it's, you know, this or this, and she's like, well, but I have examples in my mind, but because they involve real people, I don't want to use them. But this is why trying to explain symbolism, if somebody's stuck in this like 1-to-1 correspondence mode, why it becomes really difficult. And this is also why we're not attentive to it when the enemy does it, right? Is because we're looking for we're like, oh, well, here's a.
That's a good point.
Not to pick on Bishop Barron, but like, here's a religious sister, and she has a romantic relationship with Jesus. Oh, well, that's like just like Teresa of Avila or whatever, right? And so then we're like, well, okay, yeah, boom, done and dusted. You know, I guess we're cool with that, right? But there's more going on here, right? There's more going on in that relationship, right? That actually you find out that this is actually like it's a toxic relationship that, for both of their sakes, they need a divorce, right? And it's so like once you start really kind of thinking a little more carefully about what's going on, it becomes pretty clear that it's a diabolical symbolism.
For
so
sure.
I talked a bunch. I'm really sorry. Please.
No, it's fine.
That's why you're here.
No, I agree with you entirely on that point, for sure.
And I to me, what's
And I'm glad we agree that the Grail cannot be easily reduced to a 1-to-1.
Yeah, and I'm certainly not trying to do that in the videos that Pajot and I did together. The thing to understand about those videos is that we're sort of laying out basically like 3 or 4 different sources, right? And then talking about how like somebody like Chrétien, what he does with all of the sources to kind of bring them together into the mass. But it's certainly not to say that the Grail is only about that. I mean, like, technically speaking, everything is about the mass.
Yeah, you can never be right. Right, exactly. So if you're saying it's all about the liturgy, you can never be wrong when you're saying that, because that's just the structure of everything.
Right. Right. Yeah, on this we agree. Yeah. But I don't want to say that this is the only interpretive lens. Like, you could use the Grail in a story that's not about that, and you could still use it in a proper way.
Yeah.
It's hard to think of stories that do this well. I mean, The Last Crusade does it pretty well, actually. Now, the symbolism is like a lot more, because we don't have the knack anymore for...
the major thing that I was missing that I don't remember you saying, maybe you did say it in the Pajot conversations, but I don't remember you talking about the connection between the Grail and the Divine Feminine. Like, that's the part that I really felt was like, hey, wait a minute.
We referenced it, but we didn't talk about it very much.
It's been a while since I saw them, so it may have just been a part of it that I just glossed over.
We did talk about. Actually, we started our conversation with a discussion about this very important book called The Virgin and the Grail. And we talked about the connection between the Mother of God and the Grail and some of that. But some of the Divine Feminine stuff we didn't talk about. There are still things about it that I would like to say, but I'm not ready to say them on the internet yet. But yeah, there's definitely.
Well, let me know when you are ready to say them on the internet, because Grail Country would be a very good place to say them.
For sure. Yeah. But I mean, honestly, when it comes to things like discussing the feminine, and even discussing the Eucharist or something like that, I'm just really uncomfortable for all of the reasons that we just talked about sort of veiling the mystery, right? I'm really uncomfortable like getting into some of that stuff in a really open forum. That's more like a buy me 3 beers and we'll get into it kind of a situation. So
absolutely.
Yeah. So anyway, people, you can buy me beer and I'll talk to you. That's
off the internet
and off the internet. Yeah.
And that even gets into part of your point about veiling as well. That one of the things that we're continuing to try to figure out is what is appropriate for the internet. Now, that sounds crazy, because what we've done as a culture is thrown everything onto the internet that we could. And part of what we begin to see is that, no, not everything should be on the internet, by the way. And we're going to have to work that out. For me, I mean, obviously there's the interest, there's the interest in mystery for whatever the motivation for mystery itself is. And I'm less interested in that. I am more interested in, so the West takes this turn and everything sort of becomes flat. And Bunyan is, if we let's say compare the Grail stories to Bunyan, yeah, everything becomes flat. Everything becomes a 1-to-1 correspondence. I mean, that's deeply modern. That is in some ways a reflection of modernity's assumption of truth, and all the Vervaeke stuff we talked about in terms of propositional tyranny. Everything. This means this. This means this. Everything is sort of in these little Amazon boxes. You can go all the way to the beginning of Maps of Meaning. The world is a forum for objects. And that's very much the modern mind. And that then gets reflected in the storytelling. That gets reflected in the church. But then again, of course, what happens in the Reformation with respect to the Eucharist gets very interesting, because, of course, the Zwinglian fringe has it as a symbol. And
you get the famous beer and pretzels mass and all that stuff.
Yeah. And so I think so now to sort of come back around to this moment that we're at now, when we're talking about, you and Jonathan are doing your series on universal history, and some like Chris Kavanaugh are watching it and saying, that's just, basically these are grifters, because, and I can say it better than he can, because if there's no grift like the religious grift, let's say that, because people are enormously susceptible to this kind of grifting. But part of what and I think Jonathan is correct when he said a number of years ago, we couldn't be having these conversations like we're having them now, because I think, again, modernity is continuing to recede. And the difficulty that we're having is articulating and understanding how to talk about this, not just in a way that people are connecting to, finding helpful, and finding, I'll use the word, I don't love the phrase, life-giving, because when I look at what has been, what has happened over the last 5 years with respect to people finding faith again, and many of those people finding faith in traditions that are extremely sacramental, the Catholic and the Orthodox traditions. Your joke about Anglicanism and Young, Restless, and Reformed was hilarious, Richard.
Please forgive me.
Right.
Again, I'm not the guy who, anyway, but that.
Hey, I'm a very Anglo-Catholic Anglican, and I'm very excited that our new rector has similar leanings and is gradually transforming our liturgy.
Yeah, no. The joke that I made on Twitter wasn't at the expense of Anglicanism. It was that all of the, and I wasn't young, restless, reformed myself, but I had a bunch of friends who were, and was kind of adjacent to those circles. And the joke is that all of the young, restless, reformed are now old, tired, and Anglican, which is definitely the case for all the guys that I can think of. So.
Well, and I should mention my friend who, so we planted a bunch of churches in Sacramento around the turn of the millennium, and in the early aughts. And all of those churches are now, except my church, because for reasons particular to my church, they all have weekly communion. They call it the Eucharist. They have quite a bit more liturgy. They're in the Christian Reformed Church. They're really leaning towards, neo-sacramental. But one of my church planter pastors had said also, all of the people that left my church that said they wanted to go to Orthodoxy, none of them actually go to church. And so that's an issue too.
Yeah, for sure.
I think, I think Chris Green, one of the reasons he ended up becoming Anglican, he's now an Anglican bishop in a continuing Anglican movement, is his interest in the sacrament. Because he did his whole study on the view of the Eucharist in the early Pentecostal movement, and I think that's what led him directly into a more liturgical tradition.
But all of this is moving towards, Richard, you also made a comment I think it was to Grim Grizz about, if basically what I heard through your comment to him, or was to me, I don't remember which, was you need a church that's not only going to keep your attention, that's sort of a shallow way of saying it, but you need a church that you can continue to swim to the bottom and never find it.
Yeah.
And there's a sense in which Bunyan, as seen in that storytelling, I'm in the dungeon of despair. Oh, here's the key of hope. Click, out I go. That's, and I think part of the reason modernity is bottoming out, and we're having all these conversations about metamodern, and we're trying to get words around it and all, is that we simply, we bottomed out at it's nihilism that we hit this bottom.
Yeah.
That it's, and now we realize, no, I need a pool that's deeper than I. And of course, you find that in, that's why you're looking for God. And so then when of course, I'm a pastor. And so my job is not simply to enjoy deep water.
Yeah.
My job is to help people expand their capacity and their hunger and their desire for the riches and depth and for not idolatry is basically, I love the Gene Wilder Willy Wonka. It was a wonderful show about idolatry because all of these children basically sold their birthright too cheap, like Esau. And what you do as a pastor is when someone sort of grabs onto something that is working for them now, you say, I'm glad that's working for you now. I don't know how long that's going to keep working for you. So when you're tired of this, or you're finding it wanting, or you found the end of it, let's talk more and talk about let's point you to where you can go next. And I think this is a lot of where things are going.
I think that anybody who's like thinking about converting to Orthodoxy or something else, is that something that's really important that you need to be able to distinguish between is horizontal and vertical movement. So at the church, I mean, we in our long conversation, I talked a little bit about the church that I pastored for a few years, and where I was on staff, and we had a lot of people there who were not actually, Baptists in any sense, confessionally speaking, right? But they were just there because basically we, supported the lifestyle decisions, conservative, homeschooling, etc., that they were, that they had chosen, and so it was sort of like, here's the identity that I've chosen, and here's a place that lets me do it, and now I'm gonna. But the problem is that something like that is a lateral movement, right? You sort of like, you move into it from something else, and then when it stops serving that purpose, you just move laterally onto the next thing, right? And so the people that I've seen, and I've been Orthodox long enough now to see, people who were, received before me, people who were catechized at the same time as me, people who have come in since me, right? To see people, again, thank God, not a lot, but to see people who have left. And the reason that they've left is because they sort of never stop moving laterally, right? And so when when there's a scandal in the church, or when there's like a boomer who really gets on your nerves at coffee hour, or when there's a, I don't know, whatever, like any one of these things happening, like when that stuff happens, like it's very easy to just sort of say, I want to become Orthodox, but then it turns out that Orthodoxy is weird and hard and like all these different, and so it becomes very easy to just sort of say, well, I'll keep on moving, right? And instead of sort of saying, actually, no, the resistance is a good thing, this is a helpful thing, what I need to actually do is dig down, right? And understand that this wasn't an aesthetic choice, and that this wasn't for the memes, and that this wasn't for the lifestyle, but it's for Christ, and to sort of like begin your you could say like swim to the bottom, or you could say begin your climb to the top, right? Jesus does both, so why can't you? But like to sort of say, all right, now that I'm here at the foot of the mountain, instead of like going and trying out these other mountains, now I'm going to start my climb to the top. And that's what I would just say, is that when you're converting, people should, we should just be very careful and make sure that we understand, I'm making this lateral movement, but if I keep moving laterally, then I fall into like a very particular kind of sin, which is related to like acedia or boredom, right? And this is one of the main things. Like every monastic manual ever written, you could go with the Rule of St. Benedict or pretty much any Eastern manual, it doesn't matter. Every monastic manual ever written is written to bad monks, right? Because good monks obviously wouldn't need a manual, right? And usually it's written to people who are they try this for a little bit, and they're at this monastery or whatever, and then they living under this rule, but then they get a little bored and they move on. And then Saint Benedict, in his time, people had sort of figured out that you could kind of live as an itinerant monk, just going from like house to house. You show up in the village and everybody's like, oh, here's this great man of God, let's show him a good time. And then kind of whenever you wear out your welcome, you move on to the next place. And so this kind of like wandering from spiritual home to spiritual home to spiritual home or whatever, like this is actually incredibly spiritually dangerous.
Even the Dead Key warns against it.
Because you're at essentially when you're moving around that way, the essential question you're asking as you're doing that is, how does this serve me? Right? And how am I being fed? How does this serve me? Instead of asking, how can I serve?
So to
and
bring
if having the mentality of like being the question, how can I serve? It almost doesn't matter where you are if that's the question that you have. Like almost any church will end up being suited to you if your question is, how can I serve?
Yep. So what's really interesting is that the Grail question, the question that Percival fails to ask is, who serves the Grail?
I might have put it in that way for a reason.
Yeah. who serves the Grail? In other words, like, who is the Grail serving? You know, who's this for? What's in it? What's going on? Right. And that's the sort of like, if you can properly answer that question, you know, as well as you can on this side of paradise, right? That's the question. Then your own identity is going to be revealed. But actually, in that particular, the answer to that question, when Percival is supposed to ask it but fails to, is that it's not serving him, it's serving the wounded king, who we're strongly led to believe is also Percival's father, right? And so there's this like missing sense of like fatherhood and identity, and in the Middle Ages, they connected this image of the wounded king, who is also your father, right, with Christ as he was brought down off the cross and laid on the stone of preparation, which is one of the sources for the Grail. And when they and you know, there's like the you know, Lule, the falcon hath borne my mate away, my mate away. I forget what the name of that particular carol is right now, but you can go look it up. But basically, they take the all of those things and kind of layer them together. And I did I wrote a poem a few years ago, and I don't know if I read it on those videos with Pajot. Probably not, because it's not the sort of thing I would do. But I wrote a poem a few years ago that basically about this, trying to take, you know, Percival's image of like being in the ruined minster, right? What's a minster? It's a monastery church, right? But why is it ruined? Because nobody's there taking care of it, right? Why aren't they there? Because things got hard and they left, right? You know, so like he's in there and he sees this vision, or you know, like the statue, like the Pietà, right? Of here's Mary and here's Jesus, has no idea what's going on. He has no context for what's going on. He doesn't understand, so he just leaves and he doesn't understand it. But actually, that's the same image that he later sees in the Grail Chapel. And that's the sort of like, if he could understand what was going on there, then his father would be revealed to him. And of course, at the end of the day, God is your father. The church is your mother, right? That God, his father would be revealed to him, and then he would have learned his name, right? And so yeah.
Yeah, and of course, in Wolfram's version of the Grail story, Percival, he doesn't achieve the Grail, but he becomes master of the Grail castle.
Yes.
So he ends up serving the Grail.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
And I think, you know, part of this moment, so as we're seeing this transition, and as I watch the parts of the corner here, I think the mission is correct to tell better stories. Part of what we're doing is, I think, helping make the old stories accessible. I think, Richard, that's what you and Jonathan are really doing well. You're helping make the old stories accessible. When we visited the church in the Chino conference, I'll say it here. I was disappointed because I don't want to disrespect anyone here, but my preference would have been to have just toured the church with Jonathan, because Jonathan is extremely skilled at sort of giving me a tour. Because when I walk in, of course, I'm coming in with, you know, how I've been formed, and with a lot of ignorance too.
A lot of 2 CVs in there. You didn't have this?
2 CVs? I don't know what you're talking about.
In the cool hip reform circles I grew up in, Pastor Paul, a 2 CV was shorthand that the young people used for a second commandment violation.
Oh.
2 CVs.
Oh. I did not grow up in a cool Reformed background. I grew up in a I grew up in the Christian Reformed Church. It wasn't cool. It was definitely Reformed, but it's not Reformed enough for a lot of the cool Reformed kids.
You didn't have like cool slang.
In my experience, it's a very smart, nerdy denomination.
What's that, Nate? I couldn't quite hear you.
I said, in my experience, it's a very smart, nerdy denomination. At least in the interactions I've had.
Yeah, it is.
With Christian Reformed people, it's kind of intense that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have no like. The first time I came into a Christian Reformed church, I was able to strike up conversations right away.
Yeah.
So
yeah. It's a church that was diligent. I mean, and until about 20, 30 years ago, it catechized its youth. It had discipline. It was a church that was disciplined or diligent. Some of that has been lost, and so we're obviously still working through a lot of those transitions. But the what I've appreciated and where I want to, part of the reason every time you guys do a universal history video I watch is because not only do I want to grow in understanding, but there is still another move that needs to be made. On one hand, the old stories are enduring and have endured for a reason. There's sort of an evolutionary tell with respect to these things that Nassim Taleb talks about the Lindy effect. These things are still around,
right? Because
they work.
I'm a big believer in that general concept.
Yep. It's sort of hard to articulate, but I think we know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But at the same time, another aspect of this tradition, though, is the fact that almost everything that we have today has been reworked by someone. And usually, if you listen to, let's say, The Rest is History, well, there's some children's book that you got. And now you might look at that children's book as kind of a dumb children's book because, I first heard about the Grail with Indiana Jones. And on one hand, there's a world you can critique about that movie. But there's a few little things in there that you look at and say,
I think as far as Grail things go, it's pretty. I would be very hard pressed to find a better pop culture take on the Grail right now.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah.
But part of the point is that like a tradition, they do need to be maintained.
Yeah.
And you can see that with a building. Let's say you find a building that's centuries old. Every restorer has to deal with decisions that you can't, there's no good answer for. What does it mean to actually restore a painting? Because when you start getting into the details of that, you begin to learn there's no real restoring it. Anything I do will in some ways involve some levels of violation in order to achieve some levels of illumination and revelation. And so, when I look around, these are my questions, especially as a pastor, because I want to do some restoration that will involve some violation, but hopefully lead to some illumination and revelation. So I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I have a sort of a project in hand of trying to do some retelling of the Grail story to kind of as you said, maintain the tradition, so to speak. And I've been talking with Jonathan about it, so we'll see what happens. I have some other publication deadlines I gotta hit first, but I do have something in mind.
Okay. Shall we take questions from the chat? Dare we?
Let's do it.
Yeah,
all right. So if you have a question, just put in all caps question, and I'll be able to see it and cite it, and then we can take a look at it. I should show Upcycle. Thank you for your super chat. Yeah, I did. I also noticed we're all wearing these blue shirts. And I think actually Chad's question earlier was good. Why can't I just be interested in regular life with normal characters?
Well, C.S. Lewis said, "You've never met an ordinary person." So,
Yeah, I'm glad you brought out C.S. Lewis, because there was actually when the whole discussion over Bunyan was going on, I was thinking that, like, I wanted to say something then about, I think that, like, Tolkien kind of accuses Lewis of doing the kind of storytelling that Bunyan was doing, and kind of misses the depths of what Lewis was actually doing, which was kind of to restore the depths and the weirdness.
Although, just as a small detail, Tolkien was not as critical as people remember. There's more context and nuance in there, kind of back and forth on all that stuff. But anyway, but yes, like I agree, Tolkien was wrong about Narnia. And if you want to get my like take on actually how brilliant the world building in Narnia is, people can go listen to my conversation with Grizz, because I kind of nerded out for a little bit about that. But anyway,
Awesome.
forgive my interruption.
On to the questions. This is what we need to know, Richard.
Yeah. This morning it was gi training. So typically speaking, I do sort of 2 days gi, no gi, and then 1 day gi. And then when it gets really cold, maybe we'll switch it up. We'll see what the coach wants to do. But it was gi this morning. I had some rolls with some awesome people. It was a lot of fun. And yeah, at some point, I actually think that, I mean, it looks like it's a shiner or something, but it's actually an abrasion. I think it's actually a gi burn at some point. Maybe got somebody's arm across my face or something like that.
All right, so that now is answered. Good. Next question. What does the Grail have to do with fatherhood? You guys are all daddies.
Man, is there a more comfortable way we could phrase that? You guys are all fathers. You guys are all... I don't know. Okay, all right. Sorry. Too much time on the internet. I'll let you guys go first.
Okay. There's a way, and this is going to get down to Phlebas's question, which is a Protestant question, which is, I think, for me as a Protestant who remains happily a Protestant. I know I sometimes get heat from some of my Protestants because they think I don't defend the tribe enough. But there is a way, and actually when Nate led off the stream with his reading, all fatherhood is in Christ, hopefully pointing our children towards the Grail. And I would say motherhood does as well. Fatherhood and motherhood does so within their own domains or their own spheres, if I want to use a Kuyperian word. But I'll make another point that when I was doing the video on feminism earlier this week and looking at Abigail Favali's work, I've noted that for all of these, for many of these post-feminist writers like Mary Harrington, Louise Perry, Abigail Favali, it was childbearing and childbirth and mothering that all of them point to as this shook my embrace of feminism as I knew it and drove me to reconsider. Actually, last night we had a terrific Estroid meeting here at Living Stones, and my little subgroup got into mother, maiden, mother, matriarch. And one of the women of the group said, yeah, I feel like what my life has been maiden, man, mother. And she's not a mother yet. But so, yes, I'd say it's not coincidence. But even though none of us have had to bear children as fathers, fathering leads us to, I think, understanding if you father like this sort of one-to-one correspondence. Oh, son, you have despair. Here's the key of hope. No, that's not good fathering. So
I have a couple things that I want to say. So first of all, the Grail stories are always in a context that is tales of chivalry, more broadly speaking. So there's a way in which the stories are also about the proper relationship between masculine and feminine. And I would say if you really want to dive deep into the question of like, what does the Grail have to do with fatherhood, I would recommend the Christian Jungian's Robert A. Johnson's book, because he reads the Grail stories as also a story about being a masculine person and what the meaning of that is, and its proper relationship to the feminine. So I think the Grail stories have a lot to say about fatherhood and all other aspects of proper masculinity. And I would direct you toward. It's a very short book. It's like, I think it's only about 100 pages long, and it's a very easy read.
All right, good.
Go
ahead.
Just to say to that real quick. One of the things that would have happened if Percival had asked the question is that the wounded king, who was his father, would have been healed. One of the things that the Last Crusade gets deeply right is that the Grail is about healing your father. And I know there's a lot of Jordan Peterson, aficionados out there, right? The whole like rescue your father from the underworld kind of a thing, right? This is, I don't know if it's quite the same, but it's a related, let's say it's at least related symbolism, right? This idea of healing your father, that this is what the Grail has the capacity, among other things, to bring you into a healed relationship with not just your father, but with tradition. The Jonathan has said this many times on his channel, right? But the honor your father and mother doesn't just mean obey your parents or whatever, but you honor your father and mother. Honoring your father and mother means honoring your fathers and mothers, right? Chesterton said, tradition is giving the dead a vote, right? So I think that part of the reason the Grail quest is kind of resurfacing in the way that it is right now, which it seems to do every few years, every generation or two, it has a big moment, is because one of the things like the quest for the Grail is about finding your mother so that you can heal your father, right? It's about pursuit of the tradition and the feminine way that it's embodied, so that your relationship with the masculine aspect of it can be healed. I'm not saying that well, but anyway, the Grail story is about healing your father. So there you go.
Okay. Why the blue? I didn't tell everyone to wear blue.
There was no memo.
It's Mary's color. Next question.
There you go.
I think.
Phlebas, do you believe in a physical Grail?
I kiss it every Sunday.
I don't know. Maybe I'll go to Montserrat and find out.
See, and Phlebas, actually, because of course I know you a bit, because you're one of the real main people around here. In some ways, and I think Nate's the piece that Nate read at the beginning, which I know lost a whole bunch of people because you're like, well, where is this going? But the point of that gets into the question of why the creation and why the incarnation. Because what is physicality for? And even from a Reformed, because you grew up CRC, I know that. It's, why did God make the world? For his glory. Physicality is for glory. Yet, and again, we are Christians, so we believe in resurrection. So it's not Gnostic in that when we die, we have finally shuffled off our physicality and will now join the ethereal. No, it's the God's quest is how much glory can this matter embody, and we've only begun that journey.
Yeah.
So,
if the question is like, do I believe in relics? 100%. Yeah. I'm not saying I know like where the Grail is or something like that, but also like the Grail itself is like right. Well, it's the Grail is the stone of preparation, right? The Grail is also the icon of the Holy Face. The Grail is also the chalice of the Last Supper. The Grail is also is all these things, right? So in that sense, yeah, totally. You can go to Jerusalem and see a bunch of this stuff.
All right. Question. The under 130 IQ here, and I'm still unclear on what the Grail is. Can anyone on the panel summarize it for a 4th grade level?
I tried to do that earlier, but I guess I failed. It's a holy cup that contained, at some point, the blood of Jesus, and it's the object of a bunch of important quest stories in medieval literature, most of which have to do with King Arthur.
See now there's developmental levels because homeschoolers get a very good sense of if they're if they're in 3rd grade still, how do you explain it? And you explain it in a way that a 3rd grader can know. Say, oh, here's the Grail. And then there's the Grail. And then at some point they'll say, wait a minute, Daddy. I thought the Grail was a cup. And this is where you begin to learn. And you see it in Narnia.
Yeah.
Lewis builds this into the story.
But I don't start out with my children. I don't start out by trying to give them the nuanced version of stories. I just here's a saint story, here's a Bible story, whatever. Like when you're older, we can, but it's really important if you cannot appreciate the story on its sort of like on a naive level. One of my Joshua Gibbs, who's a classical educator and just a wonderful writer, he calls this high credulity. So you start out by reading the stuff from a place of high credulity. If I read in a legend that Saint Augustine of Canterbury was thinking about turning home, and then Saint Peter appeared to him in a dream and flogged him for his lack of zeal, then my first response should not be, now, what can this possibly mean? Right? We start out by just reading it as, well, St. Peter appeared to St. Augustine of Canterbury in a dream and flogged him for his lack of zeal. And then, just sort of like, you can go from there. But if you don't start there, this is one of the things that low key, this is one of the main goals of the Universal History Project, but we have to do it backwards because we have to help people like kind of step back into this stuff, right? If I tell you St. George killed a dragon, then people go, well, okay, but what is it? But if I start out with, well, dragons mean this and symbolize this, and it's like the galaxy brain meme, right? Where you start out with St. George killed a dragon, and then St. George killed a demon in the form of a dragon, and then St. George killed, this is actually not a thing that happened historically. It's just symbolic of all these different things. And then it's dragons symbolize this. And at the very end of the meme, it's St. George killed a dragon, right? If you can get to that point, right, basically, if you can have the faith of a little child, then we can begin. So
great. Good answer. Question: Is Richard familiar with Michael Pomenzansky's Orthodox dogmatic theology and its criticism of Soliev and his eternal feminine ideals taken up by Bulgakov? This is not anything I'm available to answer.
Yes, I am.
There we go. We got a yes.
I'm happy to talk about that maybe some other time. It would be a lot to go into right here, but yes, I'm pretty familiar with all that stuff.
All right, Professor Luigi. I just finished listening to all the Chronicles of Narnia, and I'm currently digesting the sort of lesson that Lewis was communicating. It's obviously not Bunyan-ish allegory. Any thoughts?
I agree. And I think Richard does too.
I think, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's helpful to take a look at Lewis's A Pilgrim's Regress. And which is of Lewis's books, not one that often gets a lot of appreciation.
Yeah, you honestly, you get like a little cred even being familiar with it.
Yeah. I was recently rereading it and my appreciation of it grew. But when I talk about Bunyan in this way, my purpose isn't to beat up on Bunyan. What is interest of me is how the storytelling has changed. And if I go out into some places near where I live and I look for fault lines and I look for buildings and ground and things like this, and then we talk about things like tectonic plates, which are these words that we use that explain earthquakes, but what really is a tectonic plate, but sort of a scientific paradigm. They say, but are tectonic plates not real? No, they are real. But what exactly is happening when we have all these paradigms? And so, to me, part of the interest in say, okay, let's look at these Grail stories and let's look at Bunyan and let's see how storytelling has changed. And let's see how this is representative of movements in culture, movements in Christianity, movements in the church, movements in theology. These are data points. And, and then so when you read Tolkien and then especially Lewis, as we've continued to try to catch up to Lewis in terms of what exactly are you doing? Why are you doing these things? And the longer we seem to be studying Lewis, the more we begin to say, he wasn't just sort of a child playing around with these things. He actually was doing a lot of things when he was doing this.
Yeah, Lewis is pretty attentive to what is expected of certain archetypes, and then is able to use those in ways that seem like they might be subversive, but they're actually revealing something more about the original. Actually, a really key scene to reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is the scene with Father Christmas. That's a really important scene. People should go back and reread that and really think about it.
All right.
I have one quick thing. I have a funny story about how I actually learned of the existence of Pilgrim's Regress. When I was a freshman at the Evergreen State College, there were two attractive young women who were in the Christian. I was an agnostic at the time. The two attractive young women that were in the Evergreen actually had a Christian club at that time, if you can believe it or not. But there was a Christian club at the Evergreen State
Evergreen's
College.
Like a pretty famous conservative university, right?
Right. But there was a Christian club when I was there, at least. And actually, the faculty advisor for the Christian club was Orthodox, by the way. Patricia Krafchick. In any case, they were reading Pilgrim's Regress, which I had not read, but I had a reputation for being smart. So they came up to my table during lunch and was like, "Hey, we're reading this. Can you help me understand it?" So that's how I first. So they would read out loud to me and I would explain it to them. It's like, okay, that's what's going on here.
Ah, beauty. It's always about beauty.
Oh, that's so funny.
Yeah.
All right. Can I start the quest tomorrow?
What day is today? It's Friday? Yes.
Yeah.
Friday's a good day to begin a quest.
You're already doing it. That's the thing. You're already doing it.
Very Protestant answer. Richard, do you know anything about the island of Brazil on medieval Irish folklore?
Yes. We may... So... The next Universal History, we've had a couple of requests. I have a very fun thing on Irish folklore to do. We may also do dragons. So, yeah, people get very excited about the dragon thing. So we might do that next. Although the one where I read a bunch of Gaelic poetry is the one I was really excited about. But anyway, it's fine. I'll talk about dragons, whatever. But yes, so we'll probably do that. We'll probably hit on that. These different there's actually a lot of medieval Irish folklore that has to do with the sort of paradisical island off to the west. This is an idea for which, for obvious reasons, Tolkien was quite interested in. And actually, if you want like a kind of a Tolkien story people are sleeping on, go look up. You can find the text online. Go look up a poem of his called "The Voyage of Saint Brendan." So,
okay, all right. Good question. What is a good Grail story for reading to kids?
I'm a big fan of the Boy's Own King Arthur, or if the language in that is a little too hard, then the Roger Lancelin Green, who is one of the Inklings, and actually also for my Orthodox peeps in the crowd, made the, as far as I can find, the second ever translation of the Akathist hymn to the Mother of God into English. Because he used to vacation, the Greens and the Lewises vacation together in Greece during the summers. And at some point, Roger Lancelin Green heard the Akathist hymn and translated it. And it's not the first translation, but as far as I know, it's the second. And you can find it in it's like the Oxford Manual of Christianity or something like that. But anyway, but he has a series of books where he retells groups of mythology. So he's got one on like myths and legends. So he's got one that's like all the Egyptian myths, and one that's all of the Greek myths. And then he also has like a Robin Hood collection of like all the famous Robin Hood stories. And then he also has one on the Arthurian stuff. And you can get it from Penguin. It's a really, really good kind of collection of all the major Arthurian material in the kind of Mallory tradition. And it's approachably laid out for young people. And that's where I would start if I was trying to introduce my kids to any of the Arthurian stuff. So,
cool. Thank you. Do you all agree with Michael Ward's thesis in Planet Narnia?
yes.
Yeah, it seemed compelling to me.
There's
I
a
read it.
surprise Saint Silouan, the Athonite, appearance at the end of that book as well. So that's pretty neat.
All right. Just going through the questions. Just remember, put question in front so I can find it. Some of you who've done super chats, they automatically get starred because that's how I sort of manage them here. What's a good Grail story for adults?
I think we might have different answers on this one. I think you seem to be partial to Chrétien, but I really love Wolfram.
Yeah, speak up.
For me, it's Percival, Wolfram von Eschenbach.
Yeah, that one is. Any of the medieval romances, if you can get them in a good translation and you can stick with it, are great. I feel like there's like a lot more. In some respects, I think Chrétien's is like more Arthurian, which is why I like it better. But
it is. It's definitely more Arthurian.
But those are all good. If you want an interesting, if you wanted like a non-medieval Grail story, I'm not sure if that's what you're asking for. Modern retellings of the Grail story that have been really good and insightful are like, it's a pretty short list. Because we get really muddled on some of the stuff, but there's a ton of good but very sneaky Grail stuff in the Lewis's Cosmic Trilogy. So that might be worth kind of looking at. And Tennyson. If you like reading poetry.
Oh yeah, Tennyson.
And even if you don't like reading poetry, Tennyson's Idols of the King, IDYLLS.
I will full-throatedly second that.
Yeah.
And I also say Martin Shaw's book, The Snowy Tower, which is his own retelling of Wolfram's, is an excellent book.
I haven't read that one.
What Martin Shaw does is interesting because he kind of like gives you the original story plus his own poetic, brilliant interpretation of the story at the same time. And the way he writes his books is very interesting. So, but he's always dealing with some traditional story, but then he's also interspersing it with his own contemporary observations.
Got it.
All right. Is the Grail more Skyrim or more Zelda? I've never played either. I'm an old dude. I only play Civilization.
That's a heck of a question. I don't know. Let me think about that. I think it's more Zelda, but
I think because at least as Zelda, at least there's like there's more of a real questing element in Zelda than Skyrim. I think because I don't know, like those games like Skyrim is like, I don't know how much of a questing element is there really.
Oh, there's the Elder Scrolls games have a lot of questing.
Yeah, the older ones, but Skyrim's kind of like me they all got progressively worse. Daggerfall was the best. And then they all got worse after that.
So for me, Morrowind is always going to be peak Elder Scrolls, but
sure, I think that's just a generational thing there.
Maybe.
Morrowind's also good.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's probably more Zelda, but of course, all the new Zelda games are open world. But that's not really like if you wanted to ask the question like which world is it more likely to belong to? It belongs in Zelda because Link is canonically Roman Catholic. So there you go.
Well, there we go.
Well, there's the answer. All right. What do you guys think of the Urantia book and movement? I have no idea what that is.
Never heard of it.
None of us know. We can't think because we don't know.
Nope.
Question: do you think Harry Potter is our contemporary C.S. Lewis? If not, who is? Have you heard of the theory that the four horses in Harry Potter are inspired by the four kids in the Narnia series?
Well, there's no doubt that Rowling is
So just to
deeply
be clear,
influenced by Lewis.
So hold on. For people who don't know, Harry Potter is the name of a character in the story. J.K. Rowling is the name of the author.
Yes.
I'm just giving Aaron a hard time. Is Harry Potter a contemporary C.S. Lewis? Well, no, because he's a fictional wizard. But maybe. I mean, as much as I love Lewis, and I named one of my children Edmund Percival Lewis Rohlin, so you can sort of figure out where I stand on like who's my favorite Grail Knight, who's my favorite, like no, it'd be difficult to love Lewis more than I do. I think that there's sort of a question in my mind of whether or not Lewis will be read in 100 years. There's no doubt for me about Tolkien. Whether or not some of Lewis's stuff is really going to endure beyond like a niche consciousness of basically people like us. That's kind of an open question. I think that, and I don't know about Rowling stuff. I don't know. We have to see if it can weather the, this goes back to what Paul was saying earlier. Like, I don't know, like ask me in 100 years. Yeah. We have to see if it can weather what's going on right now. In the Great American Divorce, I was not expecting the liberals to get NASCAR and the conservatives to get Harry Potter, but that's how it was. Very confusing. Like the liberals got NASCAR and Budweiser, and the conservatives got Harry Potter, and I don't even know what to make of that.
That's good. That's good. Any thoughts on Stephen R. Lawhead's retelling of the Arthurian cycle?
You want to go first, Nate?
I haven't read it.
Oh, I think they're pretty okay. Like that sounds like I'm damning with faint praise or whatever, but I read them. I liked them. I like Lawhead in general. I think that he's like, when it comes to the sacramental nature of some of the stuff, he's like really close, but he's not quite there. And I also think that honestly, that the books were all twice as long as they needed to be. Which is not to say I don't like long books, but I like books that are long because they need to be long, not because. Anyway, so I think there's a lot of they don't have like the same precision of some of Lawhead's later stuff, I think, and I think that just has to do with him maturing as a writer. But I like them fine. Okay, I think they're like probably like the best Christian fantasy retelling of the stuff that we've had recently.
Okay. What was good and what was not so good about Tom Holland's take on the Grail? Now, I listened to it. Did any of the rest of you listen to it?
I don't.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
So again, one of the things you have to understand about the rest is history, that they are both modern historians. And so the questions they bring to the podcast are sort of what are the historical roots of these Grail stories, and what historical movements are they emerging from? And Tom basically locates them with knights and the Eucharist. So, but again, Tom is funny because Tom, on one hand, will in his day job, he'll sort of try to stick between the lines, but he's very, in his heart, he wants to go through the wardrobe. And so Tom is just always right on that border, which makes him, for me, pastorally, a really handy guy to point people to, because people are they want to play between the lines, but boy, that wardrobe, they've heard rumors and they kind of want to, and so sometimes they move the coats aside and they just find the back of it. And they're like, oh, it wasn't real. But every now and then, there's a snowy wood beyond the wardrobe. So here it is. Okay. Let's see. I'm looking for any more. We're almost out of time. Question. Any advice on writing stories?
Lots.
Oh.
I mean, The big thing is that you need to is that we learn by imitation. So if you want to learn how to write, you should first of all just read a lot. I can always tell when a writer, or for that matter, like a preacher, has stopped reading because they'll just kind of start repeating their material. But so if you want to be a writer, you need to first of all read a whole bunch, and then take a story that you like and try to write your own version of it, just like in short form or whatever. But just take a story you like, try to do your own retelling of it. Don't worry about the symbolism. Don't worry about any of that stuff. Just try to write the story in your own version. And then you need to do this for 1 million words. And for that first 1 million words, you are not allowed to get anything published. And then once you hit that million, then you can go back and look at your work again, and you'll have a much better sense of what is good and what is not. So,
PJ O'Rourke once said that if he ever taught writing, he would only assign parody, which is kind of similar advice.
Yeah. I mean, you can do parody, you can do homage, but like we start out by learning by imitation. Like I learned things. By watching my dad do them. Right. I learned things by watching Tolkien do them. I learned things by watching, Chrétien do them, right? And so that's how you start, and then you try to imitate, and then eventually, and then don't worry if it's original or not. Originality is a lie made up by the elites to keep people from having fun, and then B, also like it's just a modern preoccupation. You think of the Middle Ages, anybody like cared if what they were doing was original? No, in fact, they would have sort of seen originality as like kind of inauthentic. So don't worry about whether or not it's original.
But originality in some sense still comes through.
Of course.
Even when they're telling the same story.
Of course, but not when you're trying to worry about it and be clever.
Originality is about your voice.
Yeah, so
which you only develop by doing what Richard told you.
Don't worry about being stupid by being unoriginal.
Right. You'll be stupid anyway, so.
Yeah. All right, we got a few more questions, and then it's noon already, so we're going to land the plane, so no more new questions. I don't know anything about this.
I sent you an article, actually, that was about Corban's approach to the Grail, Paul.
Oh, I haven't read it yet.
From Timnos Academy.
All right.
I think it's interesting, and it's definitely worth reading. I don't think he gets everything right, but here's the thing that I want to say about Corban's sensibility, that the Grail is telling us about another reality, is right.
Sure.
All right. Do you think it's reasonable to think about the Grail as a symbol of the kairos that is the consummation?
I will require more clarity on that question, I think.
I think they're talking about the marriage of heaven and earth, in which case it should, yes, is the answer.
All right.
That's why there's a connection to the divine feminine.
Would the three of you come to an Estuary Hub conference in Texas? There's a lot of TLC people in the state. That requires an Estuary Hub to be functioning.
I'm already in Texas. So
yeah. I'm a light touch. I will travel to encourage estuary growth and development. So.
Let's get together. Let's have some beers. Let's have some brisket. Let's do it. I will wear.
I know
the entire event.
I know the rector of I don't know the rector. I know the assistant priest of a church in Arlington. I can reach out to see if they'd be interested in hosting for you. Pretty sizable Anglican church.
I think Texas. So far, new things propping up. Of course, there's a lot of talk about Israel in February. Kansas City is really getting serious about doing something. There is a ton of potential in Texas. Richard Beck's out there in Texas. He's a guy that people should be thinking about. I had a great conversation with him. So, people, if you want to have an event near you, organize it and figure out how to pull it off. That's the whole deal.
I'll wear denim.
I'll wear denim too. I usually wear denim.
I think Corey's is much further south than you are, though.
Oh, I don't care.
We have cars and planes and things. Is the shroud that covers Jesus' body in the tomb also a sort of holy grail?
Yes, it's one of them. We talk about this in the video I did with Peugeot, but yes.
Yep. All right. I think that closes our questions. Thank you both for coming on this morning. I thought this was a great conversation.
Yeah,
and
I enjoyed it.
I hope those who watched enjoyed it too. And I know there's hot stuff involved in here, but really worthwhile. And just thank both of you for the work that you do on YouTube and on the internet and in the world in general. So thank you much.
Very good. Thanks a bunch.
Yeah, thanks.